window. Okay, hello everybody. So for my talk, I have in mind the question, what can numeral terms tell us about ethnolinguistic history? Okay, so I'm interested in historical linguistics, but also ethnolinguistic history. Last summer, I wrote an article on the topic of this topic in Vietnamese, and it was published in the Tạp chí Ngôn ngữ và Đời sống. And while I will review some of the ideas in that article, I have additional hypotheses about the details of this topic. I did additional research. I'll present some additional data that is not in that article. So the topic and main issues. Oops, how did that happen? Oh, there we go. The topic and issues here. Considering the etymological origins of numeral terms in Vietnamese and ethno-historical linguistic implications. There is a full system of native numeral terms that is dominant in Vietnamese for counting. Sino-Vietnamese ones are there, but they are peripheral. Native Vietnamese numeral terms are free morphemes, basically syntactic elements, while Chinese ones are used primarily in word formation, not as lexemes, so more or less, I guess you could call it morphology broadly. The retention of a dominant native Vietnamese numeral term system is accounted for by widespread usage of those native terms in the speech community over the past 2,000 years. And this suggests something of the sociolinguistic status of the ancestor of Vietnamese, even while many Chinese loanwords were coming into Vietnamese. Now, why is that interesting? Numeral terms play an important role in historical linguistics. We establish linguistic affiliation in language families. This is a crucial application of such words, primarily for single digits, 1 through 9, or whatever the system is in a proto-language. These words in Vietnamese, these words firmly connect Vietnamese to Austroasiatic as expected, but there's some complications that I'll address. But the borrowing of these words also occurs, and it helps. We can determine language contact through lexical borrowing of numeral terms. Okay, I will address both of these matters of retentions and borrowing. Now, this wholesale borrowing, the borrowing, it can occur in systems, right? So if we see borrowing of a system of numerals, it strengthens the certainty of the donor languages or the original affiliation. And numbers are interesting because they interact with syntax and morphology. So there's a lot of interesting information to get out of these. Now, there are various types. Okay, so in my talk, I want to propose that this information, these numeral terms and their origins, can be used not only to indicate language contact, but also to make broad hypotheses about the language situation in the past. And why is it that Vietnamese, with so many Chinese loanwords, has maintained its numeral system as the dominant one, while Chinese ones are used primarily as basically bound morphemes? So it is natural to, there we go. It's natural to think of commerce as being a reason for language contact. But numbers have a wide range of uses in societies, right? So this list here is partial, of course. And considering the ethnohistorical evidence of early Chinese settlers, administration, intermarriage, the sociocultural contact that Vietic speakers had with Sinitic speakers, and undoubtedly involved all of these aspects. I've published on various cultural domains of early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese, aspects of the household, housing structures, kinship terms, and grammatical and functional vocabulary. So this makes the situation ripe for borrowing of numeral terms, but somehow the native Vietic system remained intact. This would suggest that native Vietic numerals were also widely used for these other kinds of sociocultural functions. Indeed, even some of the native terms have been retained in various cultural aspects. Okay. So to put the situation of Vietnamese numeral terms into perspective, it's best to consider situations in other languages. Numeral terms are borrowed, so we should expect cross-linguistic rates worldwide. We can consider that also among the languages in the region. to give it another kind of context. We also need to consider the extent of the incorporation of such words, right? How are they used? How are they not used? How they might exemplify diglossic phenomena. And I'll consider these in upcoming slides. So let's consider cross-linguistic borrowability rates. This table shows cross-linguistic borrowability rates from the World Loanword Database from the Max Planck Institute. It's publicly available. Truly basic vocabulary tends toward the rate of 0.10 or lower. So the fact that on this, you'll see numbers the numeral terms 2 through 10 are in the 0.21 to 0.29 highlights that these number terms can be borrowed. It's not a very high rate of borrowing. Look at 100, 1000, 0, where the rates are obviously much higher. And these aggregated statistics, they leave out all the details of the borrowing, right? They don't indicate how much there is replacement of the numeral systems, but still, these number words can be borrowed, but that does not dilute their usefulness in making claims that a language belongs to a language family. It just means that, yes, they can be borrowed, right? The Kradai language families have borrowed numerals from Sinitic. That doesn't mean that, Kradai is part of Sino-Tibetan. Indeed, that's not the working hypothesis. I'll mention that. We need to consider how they were borrowed, how they were incorporated, when they were borrowed. So I'll touch on this a little bit when I look at the Vietnamese number words that have been borrowed in ways, but with very limited functions. So how do these cross-linguistic statistics compare to East and Southeast Asia, other languages in the region? Eugene Chan has been amassing a large database of number systems among languages of the world, some in coordination with the Max Planck Institute, I guess. I don't know what he's connected with now. In that database, borrowed numeral terms are noted, very helpful. In Malaysia, for example, among the languages of the Aslian branch of Austroasiatic, these are minority languages there, the Jahut, Chewang, Vietic, and others have numeral systems that are largely borrowed from Malay. And I think it's safe to speculate that this is an example of, borrowing of minority groups from a prominent sociocultural, socioeconomically influential language group, ethno-linguistic group, Malay. Now, to the north, in the region I'm focusing on, the borrowing of Chinese numeral terms, has affected other kinds of languages. So Japanese and Chinese, not minority languages, right? They have Chinese numeral terms. Their overall systems have been adapted, incorporated Chinese words. This even includes the system of using 10 to the power of 4, 10,000, and then 100 million, I guess it is. 1 million is formed with 100 units of 10,000, that sort of thing. We don't do that in Vietnamese, right? Luckily. The Japanese and Korean numeral systems are also complex, the way they incorporate them. Interesting, in Japanese in particular, this interesting mixture of native and Chinese numeral terms. And there are more instances of borrowing Chinese number terms among minority languages in the region, such as some early Sino-Tibetan words. I can't call them Chinese, but in Hmong-Mien, but that's entirely different from the cases of Japanese and Korean, all of which have consistently culturally influential, they are consistently majority languages in their area. Now, in contrast, in Kradai, the original numeral system from 2 to 99 was replaced with Chinese terms. That is a powerful example of lexical borrowing of these. Some of these Kradai numbers from 30 to 90 subsequently made their way into Cambodian, and I'll cover these latter two in upcoming slides. So the language context situations for borrowing of numerals are quite varied, from small minority groups to major languages to some that are sort of in between. But again, my concern is with all of this borrowing, why did Vietnamese not end up like Kradai or even Japanese or Korean? Oh, whoops, there we go. I forgot to hit that last bit there. Native terms in modern daily use. Okay. All right. So again, in contrast with the borrowing of Chinese numerals as like a kind of dual system, as in Japanese and Korean, among Kradai languages, the numbers from 2 to 99 have been replaced in most languages. I don't know which ones have not, well, one specifically, but it's pretty widespread and it's reconstructable to Proto-Dai. This is from Joe Pidiaporn's 2009 Proto-Dai reconstructions, and the Khmer. The Middle Chinese and Old Chinese forms are from Baxter and Cigar's reconstructions. There are no Proto-Kradai reconstructions, only those for major branches. So I can only, this is sufficient for now. Now, in 2004, Cigar noted the conservative Kra language, Buyang, which has retained parent Austronesian numerals. Okay, this means hypothetically those were the original numbers, not loanwords. That is, those original, Austronesian words. There may be debate about this, but I don't think that's I think the general consensus is that is evidence of the connection between Kradai and Austronesian. If so, that again highlights the usefulness of basic number terms in placing languages within families. Okay, in the Thai reconstructions in this table, there you can see from basically from 2 to 9 or about 2 to 10. They are expected Chinese number terms from 3 to 9. 2 is interesting because it's actually this word that means double, and it's not the word that is R in Mandarin, Nhi, in Sino-Vietnamese, Ni in Japanese. And I've not heard hypotheses for the borrowing of this word. I just speculate this reflects the donor variety of Chinese at the time, but I haven't heard any hypotheses. Now, I didn't put the words of 100 and 10,000, which have not been reconstructed for Proto-Dai, but it's easy to find those words from Chinese, 100 and 10,000 among the languages. And that's okay. So, the influence doesn't stop at these basic numbers. Anyways, let's see. In any case, I find the near complete replacement of a basic system of numeral terms from such as early period. It's striking, and but not in Vietnamese. Let's see. Okay, the neighboring Vietnamese with all of those Chinese loanwords. Okay, next it is clear that this sinicized Dai system, and I'll call it Dai, not Thai specifically. I don't know really of the details how to separate Thai, Lao, and that sort of thing. I'll just say Dai. Into Cambodian, into Khmer. However, instead of single-digit terms, Khmer borrowed these decimals from 30 to 90, not the ones in between, which are native. The single-digit terms are native. So those decimal terms are Dai loanwords. I cannot find examples of their adoption in early Khmer texts in the what's called the Old Khmer dictionary database. You can't find these. It's hard to find very much information about it. So I don't know the timing of the borrowings of them, but it's clear that they are from Chinese. But they were borrowed unanalyzed. That is the number 10 there, the sup part of it, meaning 10. It's not analyzed. It's not separable in Cambodian. And now this is not a case of a minority language, majority language. In fact, it's quite obvious, quite evident that there were both fairly influential language groups, and there was massive borrowing in both directions. So why did Cambodian borrow these numerals from Dai? My instinct is that the decimal system was somehow a factor in the borrowing rather than the earlier Khmer system, which was based on 20. Also, I'll touch on Proto-Austroasiatic numeral terms because those are in Vietnamese. There's a question about the Proto-Austroasiatic system and some implications of that. But I don't know if there's a method of determining the cause of borrowing of these. They're just widespread usage and perhaps efficiency of the decimal system. That's speculation, and I don't think anyone has explained why or can. So with this background, let's consider Vietnamese numeral terms. The numeral terms from 1 to 10, and I've divided this slide into two parts, so you see 1 to 8. 1 to 10 and 100 are reconstructible to Proto-Vietic. More terms are in the next slide, right? So they are presumably what Vietnamese speakers archaic Vietnamese speakers, Viet-Muong speakers, and early Vietic speakers have used for a few millennia. Some of those are from Proto-Austroasiatic, numbers 1 through 4 specifically. You see the PAA. The chronology extends even further back, of course. There are no gaps in the system due to borrowing from Chinese. And for general counting functions of Vietnamese, there is no fully parallel system for daily functional counting. This is the only one in regular usage today. Now, in the past, that's another question. I'll discuss the adoption of Chinese numeral terms in Vietnamese, but I can say here their use in Vietnamese, the Chinese numeral terms, in no way reaches the extent of daily use as seen in Japanese and Korean, and certainly not the replacement that was happening in Kradai. What the table shows is that from 1 to 8, all of the items are Austroasiatic in origin. Some complications are that we don't expect a final palatal stop on number 1 in the Proto-Vietic form, but I have some hypotheses about that. 2 is actually very strange because the har word, if you see the Vietic for 2, should not be something like bar, but maybe it's vi. I don't know. That's actually a complication I've not been able to resolve. Regardless, these are basic terms. I don't know how to say these are chance partial similarities, but it's just slight oddities. Now, what's happened since I published that other article is I've been working with Paul Sidwell. Paul had a hypothesis back in 2012 that the Proto-Austroasiatic numbers were some kind of, after 4, was some kind of later stage innovations. And we've been looking over Shorto's reconstructions of Austroasiatic and applying a number of criteria. And a crucial one is that valid Proto-Austroasiatic etyma have attestations and branches both inside mainland Southeast Asia and outside or on the periphery. So for example, if you look at 6 and 8, we have something both in Vietic here and cognates in Mundic in India. Now, in other cases, we would posit that this is evidence of Proto-Austroasiatic stage, but the numbers are so strangely distributed, we cannot consider them true Proto-Austroasiatic numbers. What it means is most likely the Proto-Austroasiatic system did not have a decimal system. The numbers from 5 and above are some kind of innovations. A decimal system was possibly introduced at the time of the contact between the late Huabinian groups and groups expanding from southern China. I have to go into more explanation for that. That's complicated. Oh, by the way, you might also in here, we see that Vietic shares these numbers with Bahnaric, which is kind of sort of central Vietnam, while neighboring Katuic languages have their own numbers. So Vietic and Katuic have distinct numbers, which weakens the old Vieto-Katuic hypothesis, which I previously supported until 2020 when I found better data and more analysis. And I published updated ideas that say there is no Vieto-Katuic, it's not supported, and here's more evidence of that. Okay. Now, as for the number term 10, the 2 words with that meaning can be reconstructed to Proto-Vietic. Here you can see the muento. They are not in any proto-languages that I can find in other Austroasiatic languages. 100 is found in some Bahnaric and Katuic languages, so I suspect it's a local innovation, maybe even from Vietic into West Bahnaric and Katuic. It's certainly possible. For 1000, I cannot prove it, but I suspect that's a Viet-Muong kind of innovation that spread into other minority Vietic languages. I put some in the table some quantity expressions that are possible Proto-Vietic etyma, but not Austroasiatic. But there are early Chinese loanwords of quantity terms, and I will not review those here. I've published on that, but clearly some core native quantity terms have been retained from early in Vietic language history. So good, fine. So functions of Chinese numeral terms in Vietnamese. Now, I preface this by saying this is my non-native speaker observations of the use of borrowed numeral terms here, okay? I'm sure there are other details that educated native Vietnamese speakers can consider, but nevertheless, I have to say this, okay? First, all Chinese numeral terms are available in Vietnamese, but they are not used for counting in daily context, not even when with Chinese borrowed measure words, which are rather numerous in Vietnamese, such as bao there. Bao is, a Chinese word, and 3 packages, you have a native word with a Chinese one, and that's you'll see that doesn't happen in Japanese. They combine them. It's usually consistent. Now, I'll mention this also, some other evidence in early Vietnamese for something that's different from this. Next, they are used as bound morphemes in bisyllabic compounds of Chinese words, like other Sino-Vietnamese words, right? There you see those. And they tend to be abstract, technical, indeed like the word triangle itself, right? 3 angles. And so it's, right, that's the status of tam there. And sometimes they're very formal, straightforward loanwords from Chinese. This is, like borrowing from Greek and Latin morphological materials. By in English has the sense of 2, but we can't count with it. And we certainly, now I have to go back. There we go. Something like nguhang is, very formal or metaphorical meanings, those sorts of things. And then we have uses of them in place names and names of products. I would call them almost decorative functions of them, right? Not counting. Perhaps native speakers might have other ideas about this, and if so, please share them with me. But in general, I think this is the extent of their use in modern Vietnamese. Morphological material, not syntactic constituents, not part of noun phrase structures in Vietnamese, not even used for just basic counting, except maybe in some, unusual circumstances. Okay, there are, however, doublets, and I've mainly been referring to Sino-Vietnamese proper. Sino-Vietnamese really means precise definition from the late Middle Chinese stage, approximately 1,000 years ago. There are a few Chinese loanwords here, and to my knowledge, after my research, I've been digging, 2, 4, and 10,000 have these doublets, indeed a couple of triplets. For 2 and 10,000. I won't go into the detail regarding the historical phonological justifications for these, just the tones tell the tale, okay? I can't go into detail for that. Mun itself actually has a completely unexpected tone, but it can't just be chance similarity that it looks like the old form and the vowel is expected, and it is. I found no other evidence of numerals being borrowed in the earlier period, not even 3, which is kind of an odd gap, borrowing 2 and borrowing 4, not 3, I don't know. So something happened in the early period in the first millennium, but it's not possible to determine whether an entire system was originally borrowed, and maybe 2 and 4 were interspersed with native Vietic numerals, something like in Japanese. I don't know. There's no evidence for that. Okay, let's go to some implications of these. So there was an early Vietic presence. There is an assumed presence of the Damson era Vietic speakers in northern Vietnam from the Chinese southward expansion into the Han Dynasty. I've published on this. I won't go into the details of the support for this. It's a linguistic and ethnohistorical and archaeological information. That's where it leans. That's where the evidence goes. Okay. Hold on one second. Yeah, I want to say, I present these things based on scientific reasoning and not for, it needs to be objective and those sorts of things. I don't want to be involved in any of those kinds of controversial things. I think this is a reasonably well supported hypothesis based on scientific data. There's Sinitic cultural impact in the lexicon, obviously. Substantive evidence of early to mid-first millennium Chinese loanwords, right? That's before Sino-Vietnamese. These are the early Chinese loanwords. In many semantic domains, these listed, or this portion of them, I've published on them recently, and there's more to share, right? So quite a lot of early Chinese loanwords in very, very significant. These are very profound cultural evidence of profound cultural exchange. And the shift of the measure phrase, likely impact of Chinese on Vietnamese noun phrase structure. this moving of the quantity plus measure units. I don't want to say classifiers because it includes all measure words, measures and classifiers, from a previous post-noun position. Again, I've published on this. It has to do with history of Austroasiatic, not just Vietnamese and not just Vietic. So it's important to go beyond Vietnamese, look into the Austroasiatic origins. It moved, and it looks like Chinese as the cause that. But the numerals move too, right? So all of these things. Now, diglossia, something likely past bilingual diglossia, meaning Chinese and archaic Vietnamese, we might even call it, into the mid-second millennium, as in the 1651 Vietnamese Portuguese Latin dictionary, right? Từ điển Việt Bồ La. So in that dictionary, you see something like 6 years, these examples in there with sao, nam, and both of those are nice Austroasiatic words, sao and nam, whereas Lộc Niên, Chinese there from Middle Chinese, is also an example in there. I don't know the full extent of the bilingual situation prior to de Rode's arrival. There's evidence of this, and we see that, but that didn't last, obviously. So hypothesized sociocultural status, retention of native numerals suggests widespread daily use of them throughout the speech community, whether it was monolingual, bilingual, multilingual. These numbers were used widespread for a lot of cultural purposes. There was this Middle Chinese and Viet-Muong contact, but Vietic retained a full native set, in contrast with numerous languages in the region, and sole native set in contrast with numerous languages in the region. And so the conclusion is that the Northeast Vietic branch in Vietic, I don't want to say Viet-Muong, I think Northeast Vietic branch in Vietic, had sufficient daily influence and function for this situation to have occurred. There are other possibilities, but I think it didn't get reduced and then lost and then regained. It was there all the time. That's what it looks like. And so those are my ideas, and I would appreciate any suggestions or questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just a note